Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 14 running back starter sets for the 2019 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about some news around the National Football League in terms of fantasy football and the Monday Night Football game review, talking about perhaps if there were any players that you need to be going and picking up on the waiver wire going into Week 14. Then after that, we're going to be talking about some matchups at the running back position going into Week 14, who has the best and worst matchups going into the week, and then my top 36 running back rankings. Before we begin today's video, let me remind all of you, if you have not yet already, click that subscribe button, join the community. Also, don't forget to click the bell notification button to stay up to date on my latest content. And if you like today's video, don't forget to click the like button. All right, hey everybody, how's it going? Hope everyone's doing well. All right, so in terms of news, in terms of Monday Night Football, let's talk about that right off the bat. Number one, the biggest piece of information that I'm thinking a lot of you, especially for those of you in the playoffs, want to know is what is the status of Dalvin Cook? Considering yesterday during the game, he was injured, fumbled, and taken out of the game, went to the locker room, and did not return except for to the sideline, sat on the bench for the rest of the game. As of right now, they've concluded that it is not a serious injury, but it is a clavicle injury. He's not broken anything, but it is extremely painful for him at the moment. Now, my thought process is there is a possibility that we could have, Dalvin Cook, the number 2 running back in fantasy football, miss Week 14, the first round of the fantasy football playoffs. Now, for those of you who have Dalvin Cook and have a bye week, congratulations, that's beautiful. But many of us have to continue to play, and I hope that you listened a couple weeks ago and you picked up handcuffs, especially for a blue chip player like Dalvin Cook. Alexander Mattison is without a doubt the number 1 waiver wire pickup on the week. And it's not even close. Whether you're a Dalvin Cook owner or not, there is a potential that this guy could miss the week, and you're going to have a starting running back play against the Detroit Lions defense that we all know gives up a lot of points to opposing running backs on a weekly basis, whether it's on the ground or through the air. So it's definitely a good opportunity to go ahead and pick up Alexander Mattison. I have him right below me right here. We'll talk about where I have him. Dalvin Cook obviously is to the left of me. I expect there's a potential that Dalvin Cook plays, but if he doesn't, we'll talk about where Alexander Mattison stands. Outside of that, on the side of the football where it was the Vikings, obviously Adam Thielen missed. That was unfortunate. When we're dealing with injuries such as a hamstring, it is going to take a very long time to come back, and especially a team that has playoff aspirations, they do not want to force their players back. So we learned once again the lesson that we are not going to play Adam Thielen unless we get the go-ahead on a Friday that he is practiced fully. It's probably not a good idea to even test it on a Monday night. Outside of that, the receiving corps didn't do much. Laquan Treadwell caught a touchdown off pretty much zero coverage. Stephon Diggs, after he took that little bump, really didn't show up for the rest of the game. Kyle Rudolph continued to play well, which is great. Kirk Cousins got his job done, 2 touchdowns, perfectly fine. Through an unfortunate interception that was really kind of on the wide receiver, just bouncing off of his hands. But on the other side of the ball, the biggest surprise of the night was the backfield of the Seattle Seahawks. When we're talking about running backs, the names Chris Carson and Rashaad Penny are extremely valuable right now. And from what we had, Rashaad Penny was the number 1 waiver wire pickup of last week and wasn't mentioned yesterday because, the Monday night game had not happened yet. And hopefully you had already picked up Rashaad Penny prior to that, or if he was available in your league, you had picked him up, whether you were Carson owner or not. What we saw last night with Chris Carson going for 23 rushing attempts for 102 yards and a touchdown, despite the injury that he sustained early in the game that sent him to the locker room, a potential concussion, but they cleared him to come back. Rashaad Penny had 15 rushing attempts, 4 receptions, 19 total touches, 2 touchdowns, almost over 100 scrimmage yards. I think it was like 77 rushing, 23 receiving. I think it's 100 yards total. So if I'm not mistaken, that's incredible. That backfield in itself is looking a lot like how they did last year, feeding the running back position as much as they possibly can. We saw the absence of Tyler Lockett for the second week in a row. DK Metcalf continues to fumble the ball, unfortunately. And then David Moore ends up scoring a touchdown. Hollister had the most targets on the team with 8. And Russell Wilson, for the 3rd week in a row, has thrown an interception, even though in the first half of the season, he had only thrown 1 interception the entire year. As of late, only 4 touchdowns in the last 3 games. Pretty inconsistent. and hopefully it doesn't trend that way, especially in the matchup this week against the Rams where he typically plays well. So we'll see how that goes. But again, Alexander Mattison, Rashaad Penny need to be picked up. These are very valuable assets that will go a long ways in terms of giving you depth and potential plays in the coming weeks and insurance policies for the starting running backs who could sustain injuries at a moment's notice, God forbid, but there's always a possibility. Okay, so now that we've kind of gone over some news there's a couple other pieces of information in terms of James Conner, Juju Smith-Schuster. As it currently stands, Mike Tomlin was saying that he does not expect either of them to play this coming Sunday against the Cardinals. I don't think they need either of them to win that game because Benny Snell, James Washington, they have been playing well. I mean, props to the Pittsburgh Steelers organization. Without Antonio Brown, Juju Smith-Schuster, James Conner, and Ben Roethlisberger, this organization has still managed to find themselves in the playoff hunt as a wild card. Much respect to Tomlin. He has absolutely got it done as a head coach, starting 0-3, and has really turned around this ship, and he's incredible. Other than that, speaking of head coaches, the Carolina Panthers earlier this morning, they fired Ron Rivera. Very interesting. I guess that's what happens when you lose to the Washington Redskins. There was always little whispers here and there after the Super Bowl year and how they were struggling if Ron Rivera could potentially be replaced as the head coach of this offense, if they were going to try to find a more, Cam Newton-esque, Christian McCaffrey-esque offensive coordinator genius to run this team. And I guess after this last week against the Washington Redskins, where they lost an unfortunate game while they were trying to stay in the playoff hunt, but now they are pretty much done with, they went ahead and parted ways with Ron Rivera, which is unfortunate. He's had a pretty long tenure there in Carolina. But again, that's the business. But anyway, I don't think that's going to affect very much play in terms of the team. I think they'll just continue to stay status quo. And that's pretty much it in terms of injuries and news. All right, let's go ahead and talk about the Week 14 Week 14 matchups at the running back position. Speaking of Carolina Panthers, it's not a surprise that we're transitioning right into here. I planned it all. The Carolina Panthers running backs versus the running back position, they give up the most points to opposing running backs by a wide margin. And they have for the last 8 weeks of the season, and it's not really changing as of late. Derrius Guice had an incredible game. Adrian Peterson was able to dominate that defense. And I'm hoping there's a potential that Devonta Freeman can go ahead and do so this week. I think Devonta Freeman will be a decent play. Will he be a great play? Probably not. They don't like to run the ball very often with that team, and when they do, they kind of spread it out. They give some to Brian Hill, they give them to Devonta Freeman, and then the rest of the time they're down and trying to throw the ball to try to get back in the game. But again, another good matchup for those who are going to be potentially playing against the Panthers in the coming weeks. Moving on to Kansas City Chiefs. Again, even despite how bad of a blowout it was from between Kansas City and the Raiders, we still had Josh Jacobs run for over 100 yards, which is promising. And from the way it looks, as of right now, Sony Michel is probably out of that lineup. It's pretty much James White running the ball at this point, and potentially even carrying the ball for the rest of the season for that team, as Sony Michel has been extremely consistent. And James White on the field brings them an extra depth of being a receiving threat at all times, whether he's running the ball or not. They always have to keep a man on him covered. So that also, brings an extra dynamic, presence there on the offense. Regardless, moving on, the Detroit Lions, they're always getting beat up front. Whether it's Dalvin Cook or Alexander Mattison, I think either running back is going to play well, because behind this offensive line, fullback, tight end blocking scheme, they're going to succeed because of how good they have played all season long. No surprise that one of these two, Alexander or Cook, pops off this week. Moving on, the Miami Dolphins giving up a lot of points to opposing running backs. In terms of rushing yards, didn't really see much in Miles Sanders, but he did get some work in the passing game. That's where I expect Le'Veon to succeed this week in terms of, yes, they're going to be playing in Miami or in New York, If in fact we see another one of these snowy games, then it's going to go and promote, running the ball. But we saw Daniel Jones throw touchdowns in the snow, and Aaron Rodgers throw 4 touchdowns in a snow game, which is pretty insane, but maybe the conditions aren't as bad as anticipated. Moving on, speaking of Aaron Rodgers, we're talking about the Green Bay Packers defense against running backs. Derrius Guice and a guy like Adrian Peterson coming off of a huge week, as they both have almost both of them eclipsing over 100 yards. I mean, it's going to be pretty interesting to see how exactly they approach this matchup in terms of being able to stack the box, only stop the run, and force Dwayne Haskins to throw the ball, because that's where I feel teams can get away with it. But a lot of teams have yet to do that. Carolina couldn't get that done, which is unfortunate. But again, we'll see how that turns out. Then we have the Houston Texans, who are giving up a lot of points. Obviously, James White going on a 34-point rampage makes a huge difference. But again, Phillip Lindsay hasn't really done much this year. Not sure if he's going to be able to pop off unless he scores a touchdown in this coming week. Then we have the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have struggled again against the run. Melvin Gordon, Austin Ekeler, that duo combination is going to carry this team and put up a lot of points against that run-stopping attack. Then we have ourselves the Bengals. Again, I mean, who are we kidding? The Bengals, come on. Last week, obviously, there wasn't any production out of a guy like Le'Veon Bell, but I'm sure Nick Chubb, Kareem Hunt, they'll take care of it. And then we have the Chargers against Leonard Fournette, great matchup. And then the Arizona Cardinals, Benny Snell, James Conner, I'm assuming it's going to be Snell. Should be obviously, besides being a great pickup, he's a great play this week, potentially, if he can get in that end zone like he has last week. In terms of the tougher matchups, we know what they are. We know the New England Patriots, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, 49ers, Saints. Those are teams that really do not give up a lot on the ground. Even the Pittsburgh Steelers have been really clamping up as of late in terms of stopping the run. Those are defenses that typically I don't want to play my running backs into. But again, the Kansas City Chiefs, if in fact we find ourselves with, LeSean McCoy in our lineup at the flex because he can potentially catch the ball, I don't mind that. If we're going to play Nyheum Hines against the Buccaneers, or if Marlon Mack is to return this week as he's projected to do so, that's a good opportunity. Alvin Kamara versus the 49ers, that's fine. Sure, he might not get a lot of touches on the ground, but at least he's going to get that 10 target rate that he always typically sees. And we'll see how that goes as of right now. All should be well. But let's go ahead and talk about my top 36 rankings at the position. Starting off with my number one, we have Christian McCaffrey playing against the Atlanta Falcons. And it wasn't too far ago or long ago that Christian McCaffrey had a pop-off game against the Atlanta Falcons. Again, this is a guy that no matter whether he gets it done on the ground or not, he's scoring points. This past week was the lowest scoring output that he had had since week 2 against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers when he was stopped on the goal line on that 4th down rushing attempt. So definitely struggled against the Washington Redskins, but still ended up getting 13.7 half-point PPR points because of his production in the passing game. Perfectly fine. Against Atlanta a couple weeks back, had a great game in the passing game. Great work in the passing game, but we as Christian McCaffrey owners are typically used to him scoring a touchdown every single game. There's only been 3 games this season in which not even 3. There's only been 2 games this last week. I'm pretty sure did he not score this week? Really? I think it's only 1 game that he hasn't scored, but I could be mistaken. Where is Christian McCaffrey in the passing game? He didn't score a touchdown this week. That's what it is. So there's only been 2 games in this entire season which he hasn't scored a touchdown. There's been games where he scored 3 or 2 consistently. So hopefully Atlanta is going to be the way. He's the number one. Moving on. Dalvin Cook. If in fact he does play and he's healthy and they mitigate the pain and they can get him to go, he's going to be a huge play this week as this offense really rolls through him. They run the offense through Dalvin Cook. He is going to consistently see a great amount of touches, 20 plus on a weekly basis. And to be honest, as long as we can see that and he's healthy, then I'm ready to play him no matter what. So we'll see how that progresses. If in fact, this is the thing, this is why Alexander Mattison's right here. If in fact Dalvin Cook is not to go, I have Alexander Mattison as a top 12 play either way. I would have him probably near the bottom half and probably near 12 rather than at 2. But I still really do think either one of these backs can be a top 12 play on this given week against the Detroit Lions. Moving on, Ezekiel Elliott is my number 3 running back on the week playing against Chicago. The Chicago Bears defense is not good. In terms of what they comparatively were last season to now, especially on the ground, they have been giving up points to opposing running backs this season. And yes, they've kind of screwed it, they've kind of clamped up a little bit as of late. But there are still a couple games in the last 5 weeks in which they gave up a lot of points. We're not going to forget about, the 100-yard performances back-to-back to Jacobs, to Murray. Then they had themselves giving up 10-plus points to Melvin Gordon. Jordan Howard and Miles Sanders combined for over 120 rushing yards. We had Todd Gurley go for almost 100 rushing yards. If Todd Gurley's going for almost 100, your defense, not great. Okay, let's be honest. And then we have Barkley, who struggled this season, but Bo Scarborough this past week, 83 rushing yards on 21 attempts. There is a good possibility that this is a weather game on Thursday night. Not a short week technically because they did play last Thursday, but I expect the Cowboys to get back to running the ball, especially against a defense like this. And hopefully Zeke is going to be up to task, and he's going to be a pretty good player this week. He's my number 3. Moving on to number 4, Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry, I saw a stat that in the last 16 games, so going from, he's played 12 games this season, 12 games, and then the last 4 of last season. He has the most touchdowns amongst all running backs. He has over, I think, 1,700 rushing yards. It's something crazy. He has been unfreaking believable. I mean, you want to talk about comeback of the year. Like, Derrick Henry just cashed in this year because this is the final year of his contract. They extended him for his 5th-year option. I mean, talking about cashing in for a big money deal, Derrick Henry is going to be paid next season. I mean, the amount of money that he is going to get, it is going to be unbelievable. You talk about a guy like Ezekiel Elliott trying to be the highest paid running back. I think Derrick Henry is going to have the brink truck backed up for him in his garage, and they're going to dump cash on him. This guy's incredible, and he continues to do it every single week. The last 3 weeks has had over 149 rushing yards each of the last 3 games. Has scored at least minimum 1 rushing touchdown each of those games, and he gets to play against Oakland and then Houston. I mean, man, this is going to be an easy week against Oakland, in my opinion. And I think Derrick Henry, just unstoppable. He's the number 3 back in fantasy as of right now, and he's not slowing down. He's my number 4. Moving on, we have Nick Chubb at number 5. Nick Chubb against Cincinnati should be perfectly fine. Obviously, this last week's production wasn't fantastic because he didn't get that touchdown. Touchdown upside will always save Nick Chubb. But again, this is not a guy that has had that all season long. So we're looking for the hopeful touchdown upside. Otherwise, we get 10 points because he breaks over 100, total scrimmage yards. I think Cincinnati's the week that he's going to do it again, like we were mentioning. Cincinnati gives up a lot of points to opposing running backs, and there's always a potential they can go ahead and do so this week against the combination of a Kareem Hunt / Nick Chubb. I think he's going to probably have one of his bigger weeks here in week 14. So he's my number 5 on the week. Moving on to number 6, Melvin Gordon playing against Jacksonville. Again, if we go back and we look at what Jacksonville has been giving up as of late, it's not really, I would say it's surprising to an extent, but it's something that you want to cash in on. We talked about it last week. We're going to continue to mention it. We had, Carlos Hyde go for 160, Marlon Mack over 100, Jonathan Williams over 100, Derrick Henry over 150. And in this past week, even though Ronald Jones didn't do anything, Peyton Barber still found himself with 2 rushing touchdowns and 44 rushing yards. This is a matchup that I absolutely want to play both of the Chargers running backs in, but I certainly want to play Melvin Gordon because of the guaranteed touches on the ground that he's going to get. He's my number 6 on the week. Moving on to Le'Veon Bell as my number 7. Against the Miami Dolphins, I think you have to play Le'Veon Bell. Sure, this past week wasn't beautiful. He had definitely saw a significant drop in terms of production comparatively to the prior 4 weeks or month of the season, where he was averaging nearly 15 fantasy points per game with the upside, with touchdowns or not. He was getting a lot of touches. This past week, again, they were down for a majority of the game, got a couple receptions here and there, but the game script was not in their hands. If this Miami matchup is a back and forth matchup, we could see Le'Veon Bell producing in the passing game and having a pretty good game here, in my opinion. And again, last time he played against the Miami Dolphins, 16 points, got some pretty decent work on the ground. I think he had his second highest total in terms of rushing yards in that game. Nope, third highest. So I think there's always a potential. Le'Veon Bell could have a good week here. He's my number 7. Moving on to number 8, Alvin Kamara. Alvin Kamara, again, hasn't scored a touchdown since week what? I mean, it's been a while. I think it's been week 3 since he scored a touchdown. It's been pretty brutal, but he at least scores a lot of points in terms of PPR and getting a bunch of receptions and yards in terms of the passing game. That is promising against the 49ers. I think they're going to have to use Alvin Kamara a lot. This is not an easy matchup. Sure, they're at home, but again, Kamara is going to have to move the ball in the passing game, which is exactly what we want to see. If at least he's not going to get a touchdown, he'll get a bunch of work in the passing game. perfectly fine and should be good. I mean, again, 76 targets, 64 receptions. 64 receptions, and this guy missed, 2 games already this season and hasn't really been utilized as much as we'd liked him to see or like to see him utilized. When we saw Mark Ingram leave, we thought, okay, Latavius Murray's coming in, but he won't be used that much. Latavius Murray's not even being used very much, and we're still seeing not a lot of production from Alvin Kamara this season. So anyway, he's my number 8, and I think, sure, it's a tough matchup, but I'm playing him. Moving on to number 9, Josh Jacobs. Speaking of Jacobs, so we talked about him a little bit earlier. Despite how bad the offense played, he is still producing for this team. In the last week, 100 overall rushing yards, 104 exactly, and that's great. But again, Tennessee's a tougher matchup, and they're pretty decent against stopping the run. Now, that is why I have Jacobs at 9, but I still have the trust in his ability and his production to get the job done and still be a top 10 running back in fantasy this week. In a half-point PPR scoring format. Sure, we probably want to see him get more usage in the passing game, which he's kind of lacked. And also, his touchdown count, not great. Definitely haven't seen this team get in the red zone for the last couple weeks as the Chiefs and the Jets have really stomped them. So hopefully this week, coming back home, they'll be able to right the ship and play well this week. I expect them to do so. He's my number 9. Moving on to number 10, Leonard Fournette, like I was mentioning earlier. Leonard Fournette's going to have to deal with the quarterback change, no problem. And I think he'll get back on track. Again, the Los Angeles Chargers, not that good of a defense. They have not been able to stop just about anybody, despite how much talent they have. Having, Ingram or Bosa or Hayward or, all these actual Pro Bowl talents on this defense does not make a difference. This team is just struggling, and whether it's offense or defense, they cannot find a way to win a game. And I think Leonard Fournette will be able to take advantage of the matchup and have a pretty good game himself. He's my number 10. Moving on to 11, we have Mark Ingram. Mark Ingram this past week, again, I mean, this is a running back that always will be reliable on touchdowns. Touchdown upside is what he always is going to rely upon to have a huge week. Otherwise, we're going to see, a 10-point game. Unfortunately, this past week, only got himself 7.2 fantasy points. But I think this coming week in Buffalo, we're going to see more usage of him as the season progresses. In the last couple of weeks, again, 15 rushing attempts, 13, 15, 15. We're seeing some consistency, at least that way. And last week, sure, it was a tougher matchup, but you had to play him because he's just been incredible, and this offense is getting down to the goal line. The unfortunate thing is Lamar Jackson is stealing those rushing touchdowns, which hurts, but it's just a product of the system. Moving on, Aaron Jones is my number 12. Aaron Jones, he's a pop-off kind of guy. Like, when I talk about pop-off, I mean, he had a 38-point performance, then he hit us with a 3. Then he hit us with a 27-point performance, and in the last 2 weeks has been absolutely he's been a ghost. 3.8 points, 5.1 points in half PPR scoring formats. I expect the return of Aaron Jones. As an Aaron Jones owner myself, it's pretty brutal to see this guy have to rely upon touchdowns and at such a hyper rate, like scoring 4 touchdowns in a game and getting 45 points, then having a 38-point performance because you catch all those touchdowns against Kansas City, and then having another 3 touchdown performance against Carolina. Like, those are beautiful, but you also have to sprinkle in a couple good games here and there, at least in the yardage, department. Still hasn't gotten it done that way. That's an unfortunate, matter, but as of right now, I think Washington's a game in which he can really have a pop-off performance and reclaim his top 12 status. He's my number 12. Moving on. Let's talk about my number 13, Chris Carson. Now, you may be wondering, why isn't guys like Carson, Barkley, or Gurley in that top 12? Honestly, they could change and probably be in there by Sunday morning when we do our live stream, 8:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time on the channel. Chris Carson, as of right now, this is my thought process. Had a fantastic game last night. Had a great amount of rushing attempts. Looked good overall. But Chris Carson, in the first 11 games of the season, had only had 4 rushing touchdowns. Now that you have him score a touchdown this past week, sure, if you take away that touchdown, he's not a 17-point guy. He's a 11-point guy. And that's an okay running back. Perfectly fine, because over 100 yards is beautiful. But we always will have to rely upon touchdowns. And when we're looking at a team like the Saints, where now that we have Rashaad Penny really vying for snaps and taking touches, especially in the passing game, which are ever so valuable, there is a potential that Chris Carson's value could go down if he doesn't score those touchdowns because he's not getting as many touches as usual. If we end up seeing that, we will see a little bit of regression, but I don't see it really being that big of a deal as long as he gets his touches. And as long as that stays that way, he's still a top 13 back. You're starting him regardless, so you're good to go. Moving on, number 14, Saquon Barkley. Saquon takes on the Eagles, and Saquon has been good against them in his career, but is Saquon a good enough running back in terms of in the last couple of weeks to get it done against the Philadelphia defense? Again, earlier this season, did they play against Philly? No, they haven't played against Philly this season. When I go back and I think of like Saquon against Philadelphia, I think it was that Thursday night game where he had that screen pass, absolutely broke like 7 tackles and evaded 6 different players to make a pretty big play in the passing game, and then had himself a pretty good week. I'm hoping Saquon can get back on track. We haven't seen Saquon of old in a while. I'm hoping we change it up. Last week's performance with the 83 rushing yards was great, but that was against Green Bay, not very good against stopping the run. And Philadelphia, we know how good they are. And maybe, after they got destroyed in the passing game, maybe there's a chance that Daniel Jones just wants to pass the ball in this offense, kind of avoids running the ball. So we'll see how that goes. He's number 14 either way. Moving on, Todd Gurley. Todd Gurley had a good performance. Again, finding the end zone makes a huge difference for Todd Gurley, and that's where he's been. He's been touchdown good, no touchdown bad. Touchdown, that's what he is. He's on and off every week. Now the question is, against Seattle, can he be the on player? I think after last week's Rams performance, where the entire offense, as a whole, minus Gerald Everett and Brandon Cooks, who have pretty much been relegated to the ugly stepchild or something as of right now. Outside of them, Kupp, Woods, Higbee, and Gurley and Goff were all good. Hopefully, they can continue with that momentum into Week 14 and pick up a pretty good performance for Gurley. I'm just not convinced that if, in fact, he doesn't score a touchdown, that he can be a great play for anybody. So as of right now, he sits at the number 15 spot. It could be higher, but again, very touchdown reliant. Moving on, number 16, and that's because also Gurley's number 15 because also he doesn't see work in the passing game. Like if we look at the comparison of last year's Gurley in the passing game compared to now, it's brutal. I mean, there was only a couple years back where Gurley was 500, 600, 700 receiving yards in the passing game. Now he's sitting at 134, and whoop-de-doo, I don't really care about that. That's terrible. Anyway, regardless, moving on. Let's talk about my number 16, Devonta Freeman. Devonta Freeman will take on the Carolina Panthers, a guy that has been extremely underwhelming this season. But again, still has another great opportunity against the defense that, truth be told, isn't good enough to stop any offense on the ground. Now, Devonta Freeman had 17 rushing attempts against the New Orleans Saints. In my opinion, that is not a good idea. You don't want to run the ball so heavily against the New Orleans Saints, but if you go ahead and you give 17 carries to Devonta Freeman against the Carolina Panthers, he's going for over 100. That is a given. So I'm hoping that's the case, and that's why I have Devonta Freeman here at my number 16. Again, this guy still gets a lot of work in the passing game and can definitely, get it done. This is a guy that has not had a single rushing touchdown this season. Hopefully this is the week. That's my expectation. He's my number 16. Moving on. Joe Mixon is number 17. Joe Mixon, for the last month of the season, has really turned around all of, just everything. In comparison to where he was to where he is now, Joe Mixon, the guy was just, as a fantasy prospect, was dying. A slow death. But then he turned it around in the London game against the Rams, hit the bye week, and since then, 15, 16, 16.8, 7.9, 15. The guy's been a 15-point play almost every single week, regardless of whether there's a touchdown or not, because he is getting an ample amount of touches, right? 17, 30, 15, 18, 19. That is exactly what we want to see. The Cleveland matchup is not that bad of a matchup, in my opinion. And I think Joe Mixon can be a very good fantasy prospect, especially now that Andy Dalton's back and that offense is moving that much more. Moving on. Miles Sanders, my number 18. With Jordan Howard continuously being out, Miles Sanders looks like the guy for the rest of the season. What we've seen in the last couple of weeks, in comparison to what we've seen in the past with the Philadelphia Eagles. The Philadelphia Eagles have never been a team that wants to streamline a singular running back and feed them all the touches. They have always been about that running back by committee scheme. And what we've seen as of late is nothing other than just feeding Miles Sanders the ball single-handedly. They do not trust J.J., and I do not blame them. He doesn't look good. And hopefully we can see more production from Miles Sanders. This past week, 17 rushes for 83 yards. Had that swing pass kind of wheel route onto the sideline for a touchdown in that game. The next couple weeks, the Giants, the Washington Redskins, the Dallas Cowboys, 3 games where he can run very well behind a pretty decent offensive line. And I'm hoping now that they've gotten Lane Johnson back, Brandon Graham is kind of mentally healthy. Jason Peters is still there. I mean, they still have Kelsey. There's a good offensive line here, and a lot of production could come Miles Sanders' way, especially this week. Moving on. Devin Singletary is my number 19. Devin Singletary has been getting it done in the last couple of weeks, despite, missing majority of the early season with an injury. This guy has come on late. He has taken the starting running back job for the Buffalo Bills like we anticipated, and he is running away with it and having a great year in the back end here. This is going to lead to next season. A lot of talk about where Devin Singletary stands, but as of right now, going into the Baltimore matchup, this worries me. Sure, he's coming off of great performances, but is the Baltimore defense good enough to stop the run? We saw Raheem Mostert run all over them. Is that something that we could potentially see once again if the Buffalo Bills can try to fix, something there? Either way, Devin Singletary still has value in the passing game. That's why I still trust in a guy like him to have a consistent week here. He's another great start. He's my number 19 on the week. Moving on, we have ourselves David Montgomery, which someone tweeted me. I think it said something of the extent on Thursday. It was like, I waited 58 minutes suffering to watch David Montgomery play in my lineup until he finally scored a touchdown in the very last minute to get that 15.7 performance. I mean, coming off of 3 performances of 6 or less points in fantasy to finally having a late touchdown, that is great. And I think David Montgomery could continue to be used. I mean, he had 16 rushing attempts for 75 yards against the Lions. Beautiful. Perfectly want to see that. Dallas is not very good in stopping the run. With Van Der Esch out for the last, a bunch of weeks, this team is getting battered up front. I think they'll continuously do that. The Bears are probably going to have to lock in on that and hopefully feed the ball to David Montgomery. He's my number 21 this week. Moving on to 22, Derrius Guice. Derrius Guice scares me to an extent. Despite how well he played, Adrian Peterson saw more rushing attempts than him. That is a little bit of, yes, we're passing the torch, but we're being careful about it. We're not going to 100% give him everything right now. We're going to, in increments, give him touches and get him acclimated to the NFL speed because, again, he has been out for nearly 2 years. And we're going to hopefully get him on pace and get him on track. So, as of right now, against Green Bay, I expect it to be a very good game for Derrius Guice. If anybody can run the ball against the Packers, truly, honestly, anybody can run the ball on the Packers. But if anybody's going to have the opportunity between Adrian Peterson and Derrius Guice this week, hopefully they give more touches to Guice. And he ends up having himself another good game here. He's my number 22. Moving on to 23, James White. James White, a surprising thing. He is an RB2 right now in fantasy. Sure, he went from having a 0.4 point week in week 12 to a 33.7 point week in week 13. Sure, we'll take that. But the thing that I loved seeing about James White this past week was I saw the James White of last season. I saw the James White that carried the New England Patriots through the back end of the season when Sony Michel went down with an injury in that Chicago Bears game where he got wrapped up in his ankle, his knee, whatever. I saw the James White of last year on Sunday night. And that brings back a lot of fond memories because I know just how capable James White is of being a 3-down back. Sure, you might need to bring in Burkhead or somebody else to kind of spice in a couple of runs here and there on like goal line carries or 3rd-and-1 shorts that need to smash up the middle. They did that with Cordero Patterson last year. Anybody could fit there. But to be honest, James White running the ball 14 times for 80 yards nearly and getting all those targets in the passing game, 10-plus targets, James White's going to catch the ball. And he's going to produce after the catch. That is very promising, and it's exciting to see that, and hopefully we can continue to see that, especially in a game like the Kansas City Chiefs, which could be higher scoring and could force the Patriots to have to pass the ball majority of the game. James White's another great play this week. He's my number 23. Moving on, Austin Ekeler, similar kind of running back. And Austin Ekeler, despite everything, is still a top 5 running back in fantasy because he continues to produce in the passing game. In the last 4 weeks, 10-plus, 11-plus points in fantasy each of the last 3 weeks. He's been incredible. He continues to work in the passing game, and I don't think we're going to take anything away from him this week against Jacksonville, whether it's on the ground because Jacksonville's been so terrible against opposing running backs on the ground, or through the air. Austin Ekeler, mix it a little bit there, or I combined them. Austin Ekeler should be great, and I think he's going to have a good play. It's only because the Chargers cannot close games that Ekeler is getting so much work in the second half. I love to see that, and he's continuing to produce. So, He's my number 24. All right, let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about the last 12 running backs going into week 14. Starting off with my number 25, Benny Snell Jr. I expect James Conner not to play. Anybody playing against the Arizona Cardinals is going to have a good week. I expect them to absolutely do so. Again, the Arizona Cardinals, as a defense as a whole, not great. The Pittsburgh Steelers on a run, trying to make the playoffs, and honestly have been pretty proactive in getting all their younger, experienced players in it. You know, you have Duck Rodgers, you have James Washington, you have Benny Snell behind a veteran offensive line. They are getting it done, and I think Snell this week against Arizona, considering what Todd Gurley was able or capable of doing behind his somewhat of an offensive line that was in shambles, I think Benny Snell should have a good week. He's my number 25. Moving on to 26, Carlos Hyde. Even though we saw more of Duke Johnson this past week, I do think there is a possibility in which we could see a better week from Carlos Hyde against the Denver Broncos. Now, my logic behind it, you have to kind of roll with me here because, again, a lot of people don't trust Carlos Hyde, and I don't blame you. I mean, Carlos Hyde, sure, is going to get his 10, rushing attempts per game, and he's going to consistently get those touches because he's the starting running back of this team. But as of right now, in terms of what Denver has given up, I mean, I'm looking at Carlos Hyde's touches. Sure, the last couple games haven't been great, 9, 16, and 10. But any other running back in the NFL that needs opportunity would love to have that. When we look at what's happened to this running, in terms of running the ball against the Denver Broncos, the last 2 weeks have been pretty ridiculous. We had Devin Singletary with over 100 and Frank Gore go for 65. And then we had Austin Ekeler and Melvin Gordon combined for 115 rushing yards, as a total unit. And then in the passing game, saw a lot of work. Obviously, that was Ekeler, and especially him scoring a touchdown. But regardless, I think Carlos Hyde could be a good play here. And there's always a potential that they get him more involved. So he's my number 26. Should be decent. Moving on. Again, Carlos Hyde could probably be lower than some of these other guys, but it just depends. I just think his opportunity there and the guaranteed touches kind of just grant him some value. Moving on to number 27. Speaking of needing more touches, we need Phillip Lindsay to touch the ball more. Despite how many touches he's gotten, he is still, in terms of what he has averaged this season per game, we're seeing him score like 8, 7, maybe 1 10-point game, maybe 1 15 in like the last month. That's tough. He's not scoring touchdowns. He's not getting enough work in the passing game, and that's brutal. But he's getting good amount of touches, 16, 13, 17 on the ground. That's great. I think Houston's defense in terms of stopping the run is not fantastic, and I think Phillip Lindsay at number 27 spot, I have him more comfortable there. That's where I like him. Moving on, Kareem Hunt, number 28. Kareem Hunt has continuously played well, getting a lot of work in the passing game, and that passing game work has pretty much solidified him as a flex. He is going to continue to be a flex at this current juncture of the season and the way that he's used in the offense. So I'm perfectly fine with continuing with Kareem Hunt, especially against Cincinnati. In the last couple weeks, seen a limited amount of work in the running game, 4, 6, 8, 7 rushing attempts, but still has a good amount of yards there and a great amount of work in the passing game, leading to some touchdowns each of the last 2 weeks. Should be good this coming week. Moving on, we have ourselves Jamaal Williams. Jamaal Williams is a little bit tricky too. When we think of Jamaal Williams, he's a hell of a running back, that's for certain. But the question is, as a guy that's a number 23 running back in fantasy right now, is he a viable enough play without scoring a touchdown? I think as a flex, sure. Certainly. There's a little bit of a mix there. I always do that though. I think last week, sure, wasn't great, but again, 10 rushing attempts minimum each of the last 3 weeks. It's exactly what we want to see. And with Aaron Jones not really getting it done, Jamaal Williams has seen more work, especially when this team is passing the ball. He's a great pass blocking running back and a guy that's pretty decent at route running. Has gotten it done. So as a flex against Washington, don't mind it at all. Moving on to Matt Breida. Okay, so I'm only going to talk about the 49ers. I'm going to talk about all the 49ers running backs at this point. Matt Breida, Tevin Coleman, Raheem Mostert, Jeff Wilson. I don't know who's going to pop off because, to be honest, it could be any of them at any given moment. If Matt Breida comes back and he's healthy and he's ready to play, I'm putting him in my lineup putting him in my lineup as a flex if I have, and that's the best option. I'm putting him in there. But they play against the Saints in New Orleans. But again, this is a great running team. regardless of what kind of defense they're playing against, they always play well on the ground. So Matt Breida, if you're healthy, you're ready to go, nobody else is going to take your job, I think you're a decent play. Moving on to 31, Kenyan Drake. I know a lot of people are questioning whether this running back position for the Arizona Cardinals really does have value. And a lot of people have asked me, Andrew, should I be dropping a guy like Kenyan Drake? Because he is doing nothing for me, and he's doing nothing for the Arizona Cardinals after that debut game. And I'll be honest, it's kind of tough to watch him put up single-digit performances in the last couple of weeks with the amount of opportunity that he's gotten. But again, it has to do with the lack of usage in the passing game. They need to feed him like he is David Johnson. They have yet to do that. David Johnson's MIA. I think that entire backfield is cursed this season. And if you're going to have to play Kenyan Drake, go for it. But unless he's catching a bunch of passes, I'm a little concerned. Bo Scarborough is my number 32 as of right now, playing against the Vikings defense. Prior to last night, the Vikings defense had only allowed 2 running back touchdowns or 2 rushing touchdowns on the season, and only 90-something yards per game. I mean, they blew them over. Is there a possibility Detroit does that? Probably not, but I think Bo Scarborough is a decent play in terms of getting the yards per carry with David Blau, kind of spreading the field out. I think he'd be a decent option. Moving on to keep Peyton Barber. Ronald Jones is dead to me at this point. Peyton Barber against the Indianapolis Colts should be a decent play because they are going to get red zone opportunities, and Peyton Barber always likes to steal touchdowns, so could be a good play there. Nyheum Hines on the other side of that. If Marlon Mack plays, Nyheum Hines is pretty much evaporated off this list. Marlon Mack will come in as a top 24 play, and we'll see how that approaches. But as of right now, Nyheum Hines should be a decent play here if, in fact, Marlon Mack does not return from his hand injury this coming week. LeSean McCoy is my number 35. If, in fact, Darwin Thompson or Damian Williams are both active and, we're going to see a 3-headed monster here, then it probably devalues every single one of these guys. But as of the bunch of them, LeSean McCoy continues to get goal line touches despite anything, and that is extremely valuable as a flex option, potentially. Last one, Patrick Laird. Here's the thing. Yes, you get to play against the Jets, but you're probably starting running back. Kalen Ballage dealing with an injury. Should be a decent option, pretty decent fantasy pickup if you are in need of a flex option. That is it. I want to thank everybody for watching. Those are my top 36 running back rankings as of Tuesday, December 3rd. Thank you, everybody, for watching. If you haven't yet already, click the subscribe button, click the like button if you like today's video. We will be back tomorrow for some wide receiver Wednesday, as we typically are. And until then, I appreciate everybody. Have a good rest of your Tuesday, and I'll talk to you guys later. Peace.